warm welcome from the European Evangelical Alliance Bonn office side. My name is Matthias, and for those of you who are joining us by watching this video, welcome to the EEA Zoom Café on this 25th of January 2023. It's our first Zoom Café in the new year, and we are happy for colleagues who have gathered today and who join this virtual conversation. We have seen the latest socio-political report by two EEA colleagues here. Julia and Dr. Purser is EEA Socio-Political representative and religious liberty coordinator, and Ari de Pater is our Brussels representative for the European Evangelical Alliance in the European capital, if we can say so. So both of you are doing this work since many years, and you are publishing this socio-political report regularly, and it's read across Europe. And for this Zoom Café, we said, why don't you give us a little bit of more context to your work, and also what your recent experiences and activities were, and also how you look upon this new year, which has just started with all the challenges that we are well aware of. So this can serve as a conversation starter for the Zoom Café. Of course, we don't need to be too formal here. It's also meant to be a nice gathering during lunchtime, or for some of us lunchtime. So we will also enjoy ourselves by having some easier conversations later on. So thanks, Julia and Ari, for joining, and I hand over to both of you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Matthias. Hello from Brussels to all of you. Greetings. Yeah, it's looking back on my years with the EEA. We started 5 years ago, or I started 5 years ago with a presentation in the European Parliament on the double vulnerability of refugees who came to Europe, or who applied for asylum because of their religion. So the converts. And at that time, it was, I think, hardly any people really knew what to do with these claims, with these people. And now, 5 years later, fast forward to November last year, the European Agency for Asylum published a guide for immigration officials who interview people with a religious-based asylum claim. And that was really, well, it's not really the end of a process, but it took them 5 years to understand how to deal with converts and how to interpret their testimonies, because in many countries they just were kind of clueless to while interviewing the converts. So over the last few years, we had various discussions and debates, also as EEA, with our partners in the various European countries, in the various member states, also looking for best practices. So earlier last year, we also published our own guide for churches and individuals who are dealing with refugees and with converts, who support them in the process, but also for immigration officials. And it was great. It was really encouraging to me, and I think it's encouraging for all of you to see that many of the recommendations that were included in our own best practices document for immigration officials is now also reflected in the EUAA guide for immigration officials. So the focus not on facts but on the journey, on your faith journey, what motivates you, how did you get to this point? We all see that now reflected the safety of the place where they are interviewed, the security for the also to have good quality interpreters, and everything is now included in the guide. And that's not the end of the process, but it's at least it's a very helpful document for all of you who are dealing with converts, who are in regular contact with them. And if you see that in their procedure there is something wrong, and the interview wasn't fair, the interpretation of the testimony wasn't well enough, you can use the guide and refer the guide to the immigration officials dealing with that particular case and say, well, these are recommendations from a respected EU agency. Please, could you take them to heart and implement them in your protocols and practices as well? So looking back on last year, that was definitely one of the things that we celebrated as a socio-political team.
Yeah. Thanks, Ari. So hello, everyone. I'm hello from the south coast of England, where it's absolutely freezing right now. I'm wrapped up warm and the house isn't very warm. First thing I want to share is about our collaborative work on religious freedom. So throughout 2021 and the first half of 2022, we had our religious freedom learning community, which was, I think it was once a month, an hour where National Alliances could learn and share about how they can defend religious freedom in their nation. Because in the end, if anyone's going to defend the religious freedom and strengthen religious freedom of evangelicals in a nation, well, that's the National EEA's job. EEA can help, but it's the National EEA's responsibility to have a way of knowing what's going on and being able to be wise in pushing when there's a problem, and also pushing proactively before there's a problem and trying to change attitudes. So we had a really good 18 months of meeting, and then we kind of ran out of topics for the time being to talk about. So we paused the learning community, and I decided to write up all the good ideas that were shared. So a lot of what we talked about had come from experience we've gained from other national alliances who've been doing more work over the years, and conversations at our annual European and Religious Liberty Forum. But then within the learning community, people shared really good ideas. I remember one of them in particular was that, especially in a country perhaps like Greece, where evangelicals are seen as, well, you're not proper Greeks, because that, you have to be Greek Orthodox to be a proper Greek. And there can be an attitude of, you're a minority, so just be grateful for what you've got and shut up, don't ask for anything else. So, and that attitude can be conveyed, and it can actually influence us, that we go, oh, okay, we have to be grateful, and we can have a timid attitude both to our rights and also to our mission and to how church does. And it's true that, in Greece, you are a minority. Actually, everywhere across Europe, evangelicals are a minority, but there's this minority attitude in some countries that's understandably imposed from society. But we need to be able to overcome that when we say, hang on, we have basic human rights in international law, and we have a right to certain rights. Anyway, we had the FoRB learning community, and then I decided to write things up, and we created a guide for National Evangelical Alliances in particular to work out how to defend religious freedom. And we wrote it in a way that has, these are the basics, and then you have, if a bit more capacity, you can do this, and if you have a bit more capacity, you can do this. So it's not you have to do everything, but here are the essentials. So you can find that guide online on the EuropeanEA.org website. We have the resources tab. There are all sorts of great resources there, but there is one tab which is religious freedom, and the FoRB guide is there. And it also points to some of the other documents that we produced. So for example, there's one about when a problem arises. So if suddenly there's a crisis, what do? What are the basic things to be thinking about, checking? What information would EEA need if it was going to help, etc. So it's a good resource. We we are always open to learning more about how we can help you. And if there's a desire for a new round of the learning community where people can think about how they strengthen their religious freedom and to share what they've learned, because it's not about us telling you, you've got stuff that you can share with us so that we can grow together. We're really open to continuing to work with you. And of course, if you do have a religious freedom problem or a good religious freedom idea of strengthening religious freedom, please let us know. And we'd love to work with you. Oh, yes, then it's me. I have another topic. So also last year was the 10th anniversary of the Global Charter of Conscience. And that's a international document that EEA is really strongly supportive of. And it talks about a vision of a civil public square, which we think is essential for everybody, be they evangelical or Orthodox or Muslim or atheist or radically vegan or whatever, that everybody can be themselves, live according to their beliefs, share their beliefs, argue and disagree with each other robustly. But if I am going to have my freedoms, I have to be concerned that you have your freedoms. Because if we only defend our own and don't care about the other, well, they're going to do that back to us and it all falls apart. And so the civil public square is about asking governments to create a civil public square. And you can't impose civility. If you impose civility by having strong hate speech laws, well, actually that's censorship. That's not civility. You know, people have to be free. With, you know, hate speech laws can have a high, you know, there should be hate speech laws when there is genuine harm, but otherwise we have to cultivate civility and an understanding of the importance of human rights for all, especially freedom of religion or belief. So it was the 10th anniversary last year of the Charter, and we worked with some of our national alliances to get new endorsements of that Charter. So not just from Christian leaders, but Albania especially, we had various faith leaders endorse the Charter because it's a document that we need everybody to support. It's not just for Christians. Secular people, Muslims, whoever. We also added some articles on the website of the Charter and about what the Global Charter and the Civil Public Square looks like in practice. And we've added stories to illustrate that are on the Charter of Conscience website and also on EEA's website. Again, under resources, there's a tab that says Civil Public Square. And you can see some stories that illustrate what a civil public square looks like in practice.
Yeah, and it is something that I would love to use here in Brussels as well. The document, if you haven't read the Global Charter, please do, because it is really a very helpful and very well thought through document about the civil public square. It isn't something that you can just organize at high political level. But at the same time, yesterday there was a debate in Parliament on religion and democracy. And there were several MEPs, not too many as usual, but there were several MEPs also calling for more dialogue. So I got back to them this morning, just before this call, sending them an email and said, well, yes, dialogue is definitely crucial for any democracy. But do politicians always set the right example? Too often, what I see here in Brussels, too often, the committee meetings are just kind of a place where you deliver a statement and where you do not necessarily listen. So you make a statement, you make sure that it's recorded on camera, and then you publish these on your social media, and then you leave the room, and that was it. That was your kind of firm statement. You were true to your dogma, to your principles. That's it. I would love to change that here in Brussels, in the European Parliament. So we are discreetly reaching out to MEPs from the different countries, from different political groups. So from left to right, we hope to bring them together in a more informal setting. And of course, I don't expect all 700 of them to show up, but if we could start with a small group, let's say maybe 5 to 10. I don't care, as long as we have a first start where people can really get into a frank and candid discussion why some of the topics that are discussed here are so close to their heart, why they feel so strongly about it. And that is something that we call for in the civil public square as well. Let's have an open debate, especially on these things that we feel strongly about. And we won't start with the most contagious topics, of course, in these informal meetings. Initially, it's just to build trust, and then possibly we could invite some experts to talk about some medical issue, ethical issue, possibly a technical issue like artificial intelligence and how we feel about that. But we just started, and I really appreciate your prayer to find the right people, to come together, willing to invest a few hours into this meeting, to listen without any cameras, without any publicity. So yeah, it's an important project for me for this year, and I appreciate your support in prayer.
Thanks, Ari. And the final thing I want to talk about is something I'm quite passionate about. There are lots of politicians in Brussels and across Europe that talk about and promote Christian values. The trouble is that often when they talk about Christian values, the list of what they call Christian values is very short. And my understanding is that Christian values is much broader. So Ari and I like to talk about biblical values, just to have a different term. And if we think about the person of Jesus and also just the whole range of scripture, then there are loads and loads of values. And also one of my things is the issue of abortion is incredibly important, but actually it's not a value. The value is the preciousness of every human being, from conception, the dignity of human beings, and they're all made in the image of God. That's the value. Anyway, in Sarajevo, when we had the Hope Gathering, Ari and I were able to lead a builder group, and we looked at biblical values. And the way we did that was we had a really good discussion with everybody. And we asked everyone to think about their own nation and to pause and think, when God looks at your nation, what makes him smile? And I asked people to come up with, I think, several things. And we had a big range of things. And I guess I could sum it up that every time God sees love and care and concern for the vulnerable and families working well together and generosity and integrity and all sorts of things, he smiles. And then I asked, but when God looks at your nation, what makes him sad or angry? And again, people wrote down, they were writing on Post-it notes, those things. And so that could have been, I don't know, the issues of too much stress on sexual freedom was there, but so was, I'm trying to remember now,
individuality.
Things to do with corruption, to do with throwing migrants back in the sea, in the Mediterranean, all sorts of things like that. So we looked at all the positives that we posted up on Post-it notes, and then the negatives. And then I said, okay, what are biblical values? And by doing the two questions beforehand, it was very easy for people to come up with a huge selection of biblical values. It wasn't necessarily the definitive list. We only had a certain amount of time, but it was a really encouraging issue. And I wrote about that in the December newsletter, which had an EEA newsletter, which had a socio-political focus. I wrote an article about that process and about what people wrote down. And I just think I would just love to see pastors asking their churches these questions, home groups, having these kinds of discussions, helping people think, yes, what is in God's heart? What does he love and what makes him sad? And therefore, what are biblical values in that full range? And then we know what to pray for. Then we know what to work for. And actually, Christians are doing those things. But having a really strong image of biblical values helps us as we listen to politicians who just go and talk about Christian values. So, and just to sum up, Ari is in Brussels. His main focus is looking towards the EU institutions on your behalf. My focus is more looking towards all of you and helping you. But, we are both here to help you with your socio-political problems and questions, and also the opportunities. It's great when evangelicals are not just defending and opposing, but actually, what are we trying to promote? So we really do want to work with you in your socio-political witness. And we would argue that it is part of our witness, it's part of our gospel witness, that as we speak up and also we act practically in society, people get a glimpse of who the King of Kings is, and then they're going to be more interested in getting to know the King of Kings by accepting the gospel. And we also need your help. So very occasionally, Ari might be asking for your help in talking to MEPs or national governments. Right now, I want to ask for your help because we have a new Cross-Current course starting in November. Cross-Current is a 3-year mentoring program for evangelicals in their 20s and 30s who really feel called to serve God in public life, be that politics or civil service or NGOs or diplomacy, those kinds of things. It's a fantastic program that IFES run and I lead for them. And so if you can help us find individuals who might be interested, please, would you let me know? And please pray for us. We really need that.
Yeah, I can only copy that.
Oh, thank you, Julia and Ari, for that input and overview over your amazing work. Let me add one thing from the Bonn office side, as we are also looking at admin and finances. Let me also add that this is a stream of work that also needs financial support. Because it does cost something to have people really dedicating a lot of their time to this kind of work, and to travel to Brussels and to get access to meetings, and the infrastructure involved is also one thing. And this is not the typical ministry that sort of is easy to fundraise for. That's why we are also encouraging our European network to understand the level of impact we're having there on the socio-political level, speaking into the halls of power, speaking to key decision makers in Brussels, but also in national governments. And if you're one, or if you know someone who really is spiritually, prayerfully links into that, to say this is something I want to support through the support Julia and Ari have asked for, but also on the financial level, we would really appreciate that because we do want to increase even our impact here and what we can do. So we have time for a couple of questions and also to get into a discussion on some of the points Julia and Ari have raised. To give you a little bit of time to think, I will ask the first question from my side. It goes to both of you, Julia and Ari. Just recently, we've seen this initiative by Nehemiah Center and Jon Boyner from Denmark, also bringing in his colleague from Denmark, Michael Lausen, and there will be a Brussels-based event teaching and empowering church leaders and evangelical alliance representatives and also ministry representatives how to interact with political decision makers. I think that will happen pretty soon at the beginning of February. My question behind that is, you are two people fully involved in this work, but there are more people in different countries in Europe that you're also working with, alliance representatives. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Where do you work together with people in countries that are linked to some of our national evangelical alliances? Also, what is maybe your wish for this group to grow? And what has worked well when cooperating with them?
Ari, do you want to start or shall I?
Yeah, well, you're more in contact with National Evangelical Alliance than I am. But,
okay, so Matthias, I think the question is, who do we work with and how do we work with them? That's the question. Okay, so obviously our main desire is to work with National Evangelical Alliances and our other members, so our network. So, for example, I'm heavily involved in the European Freedom Network on human trafficking and sexual exploitation. And this morning I was just working with a group as we are wanting to influence the EU on a due diligence directive that's coming through. So we do work with some of our networks. We're very happy to work more if there are socio-political issues. I mean, very often there are, and sometimes it connects with Brussels. And Ari, he's not an expert on education. Graham and friends are, but yes, it's being able to. Ari is our person in Brussels, and he can help get a good voice into the Brussels situation. In terms of our regular interaction, we have our EEA advocacy network, which is for evangelical alliances who are working regularly in socio-political areas, at least on a couple of issues. So if it's just, very, very rare when there's a religious freedom problem, it doesn't quite work. But when people are working reasonably regularly, we meet once a month just to give each other updates. And there's about 8 to 10 alliances now in that group. But then from that, we are just beginning to have some extra meetings. So we want to have a freedom of expression consultation sometime this year online, which will be less about the problems. We all know the problems, but more about how do we do something about it? How do we get back widespread public and political support for freedom of expression rather than what we're seeing, which is a reducing of support for that right. So that's my regular work. We have another group that looks at religious freedom in where it kind of clashes with issues to do with LGBTQ rights. And we have some other partners who join that group who aren't national alliances, but who can advise us. What else do we do? When we're coming up with a new political position on an issue, we have our public policy authorization team. So every 4 years, the General Assembly members meeting get to vote on a group of people who will be on that authorization team, and they're there to represent you. So basically, we can't ask all of you what you think on policy X or political issue Y, because you're all too busy to respond. And trying to get consensus would just be too complicated. But we have a group that we trying to make sure it's geographically representative, and trying to sense a little bit where the people's politics are, so that if we can get them to agree, then it's okay. Sometimes we go an extra level. So if it's a controversial issue, we get the board to sign off. I remember when we worked on the issue of refugees and migration in 2015, when it was, it's a political hot potato, very controversial. I deliberately went to people I knew in evangelical alliances who I knew, because I knew them, that one was distinctly right-wing generally, and one was distinctly left-wing generally, but biblical evangelical people. And I thought, well, if we can get them to agree, then we might get things right. And that worked. That they said yes, they saw our draft of our refugee positions and said yes, that's fair. We weren't just pushing to let everybody in, and nor were we saying keep everybody out. So that's ways we interact. Oh, and yes, the European Religious Liberty Forum, which is an annual gathering that we don't talk about. We don't talk a lot about for security reasons, but that has EEA members coming, but also lawyers and NGOs like Open Doors and Forum 18 and others, and a few non-evangelicals as well. Yeah, it's slightly broader. That's what comes to mind. Ari, do you want to mention anything else?
Yeah, well, for me, it starts with why am I doing this? And I hope that you all agree that the Bible is good news for everyone, also in our member states. So too often people are looking at Brussels and say, well, yes, we can't do it because of Brussels, or we have to do it because of Brussels. But politics is not just European politics or just Brussels. It doesn't even start here. Politics starts just in your street and just at local level. And too often the debates here in Brussels are quite abstract, very high level, more about numbers and statistics, and not too much about people. And that's, for me, that's why it's important to have your input. That's when there is a debate on education, Graham knows the examples. He knows the kind of the specifics of how these things could work out in practice. That is true for education. We have also the Refugee Highway Partnership that is bringing together people, all people working with and for refugees. These individual stories communicate so much better than just another statistics and another percentage of people accepted or rejected. And that's true for freedom of religion or belief as well. You can have very kind of high level discussions about freedom of religion or belief, but if you can't bring that back to kind of situations where people can easily relate to in their kind of personal life, in their environment, it doesn't really help them to understand the issue and why religious freedom is so important for us, but not only for us, but also for them. So it's these contexts that I can't do without, and that was also true for the Civil Public Square. We can have very kind of high-level discussions about why it's important to have a dialogue and have a Civil Public Square, but if we can't show it with some very specific examples how this works out in practice in your environment, in your municipality, in your region, in your country, it doesn't really help. So that's why it's important for me to have this regular feed of real life stories that will help me to do my job here in Brussels.
Yes, Ari, I just want to underline that EEA has such a privilege that by connecting with you, and you connect with churches and individual, projects on the ground, the network is vast, and then the authority to speak is vast, because you know stuff, you have stories, you have evidence, and the people on the ground may not have ever thought about talking into politics. They may not have the skill to do it very well either. They may do, and we can help them, and maybe it's not their gifting, but actually they can give the information and pass it on to us. Or, so for example, Stephanos in Greece, is if there are, I'm sure there must be times when on the issue of refugees, because evangelicals are doing so much and so much and you see it and you have real life stories, then you are able to talk to the Greek authorities about, hey guys, can you change this, or can you train the police a bit better in this area, whatever it is, because you have evidence to pass on. And us working together as a body, as a really good network is vital at national level and European level.
That's quite a long answer to a short question, Matthias, but I hope that helps.
We can talk.
The question was also long, so it's all good. No, great. What we definitely want to do still in our time is to pray for the two of you. We will then stop the recording, but before we do so, we have more time for questions, but also contributions, perspectives from the others here in the call. So please, Graham.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what you were saying, Ari, about trying to pull people together to really talk about things rather than just make representative statements or something like that. I've certainly noticed that. So just for everybody else's benefit, the group that I'm part of, which is, it's not the EEA group, but I'm part of another group that meets at the European Parliament buildings in Brussels, and we get a whole range of really interesting people. Well, most of them are interesting, not all of them, but coming into to talk. And you know, it just, people breeze in and they do their thing and they answer a couple of questions, they breeze out again, and I just think that's so functional. It's so functional, it's actually quite rude in a sense. It's, you know, they're not involved, they're just fulfilling a role here. So my question is this: what's the space that you can occupy in the working of the European Parliament? In other words, you know, there's all this functionality going on, and you have a functional perspective as well. You want to see things changing in certain areas, but what you were talking about, Ari, is of a different kind of nature. So what's the space that you're trying to occupy there, or are you creating a space that isn't there?
Well, for this particular project I'm working on, it's creating a space, really bringing people together for really personal discussions. And I strongly believe that we as Evangelical Alliance have an opportunity, and we are one of the few organizations present here in Brussels who can do that, who don't have a very specific political agenda on one or two particular topics. There are, well, we all know there are thousands of lobbyists here in Brussels. They all have their own particular political agenda they want to foster here in Brussels. And for us as Evangelical Alliance, we are fairly unique here in that kind of more neutral presence. That's why I strongly believe that if there is anyone here in Brussels who can bring these people together, then we are one of the very few. So that's what I appreciate. And other than that, of course, I can still bring our arguments to the committees and to the members thereof. That is a space that is always there. All MEPs are meeting, and their staff are meeting with lobbyists all the time. Well, they need that as well. They need the input from civil society to defend their positions and to define their positions. But so we can still do that. That is a kind of a regular practice that is quite common in politics. But bring people together, that is fairly new. So I hope to create that space rather than to use a space that is already there.
We're not neutral on everything. We do lobby, we do have positions.
Oh yeah.
But I guess Brussels can be extremely polarized. what people can be called, put themselves in the so-called liberal camp and the so-called conservative camp. And they do not like each other. So that's what we're trying to bridge a bit. I'd say that there are sometimes places where people connect well across party lines and philosophical lines. So in the so those who define themselves as Christian, often, you know, they connect in prayer groups and the European Prayer Breakfast movement, so that kind of thing. My guess is, so MEPs, you know, they are all in delegations for particular countries. So I can just imagine that, you know, if they're all on, you know, on the plane to Azerbaijan and then on the bus into town, you know, they will be they will be meeting and mixing as human beings. It's not that they all hate each other outside their parties.
No.
We are, I think Ari is going to be trying to build some trust across that liberal conservative divide and try to encourage them to listen to one another on issues that are reasonably controversial, but that don't blow things apart before we've even started.
Yeah, I think that's a really significant thing. Well done. God bless. We'll be praying for that.
You.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one short question, please?
Of course, Stefanos.
To ask Ari and Julia, and thank you very much for all your hard work. You mentioned, you know, bringing people together to talk, and the evangelical presence is there to share our thoughts and concerns and everything. As you said, Julia, there are usually two parts, you know, the liberal and the conservative, but somehow in Greece, they seem to connect and follow somehow a similar path on issues that are of high concern for the evangelical community.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, the whole idea about sex, so on, and for example, the sanctity of life and the respect of human life and so on. Do you see also what we kind of see here, that although they are in different political sides, you know, conservatives and liberals, do you see them also at the same time connecting and having a kind of a similar opinion on those issues as well? Because these are issues that, unfortunately, you know, we don't want to, you know, I hate it to to bring the conversation to something that it seems to be the main agenda, like in the United States. But unfortunately, it is coming here because we have to give answers to those questions as well.
Ari?
I don't really see them coming together here, especially not on the topics that you mentioned, Stefanos. I don't see any closeness between there is definitely quite a deep schism between the conservatives and the Greens and the liberals, especially on the topics that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. On artificial intelligence, it might be a little bit more mixed, where there might be a little bit less of a party divide there, a left-right divide there, but even there, but it's less. I think it's less kind of entrenched. So there's a little bit more room for candid discussion, whereas on topics like abortion and same-sex marriage and these topics, there definitely is a huge gap between the two positions.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that everyone who is right of centre is pro biblical marriage and everyone who's left is not. That it's not that simple. So within the European People's Party, so that's the Christian Democrats, there will be people who are no longer conservative on those issues. There will be some also left of centre who are uncomfortable with so-called progressive ideas on these kinds of issues. Yeah, I think perhaps it often depends on where a country is, and once a country has at a national level where they have, say, adopted liberal rules on abortion, or have accepted same-sex marriage, etc., then more or less the whole political class switches. It becomes the issue that they're going to go for. But across Europe as a whole, there are nations that are still extremely conservative and others that are extremely liberal, and that's what makes Brussels very polarized.
And I don't want to point that these are the issues that are of #1 priority for the Greek evangelical community. But there are a number of other issues as well. But I feel that the Greek evangelical community is trying to find a way to communicate the biblical truth in a way that it is also biblical and also following Christ's steps and example. That's why I mentioned that. Let's
talk. I will email you. It's not that I have all the answers, but we can learn from you, and you can perhaps learn from us or what others are doing. So, yeah. Just quickly on that, on the issue of abortion, there is a wonderful example of a campaign in Northern Ireland called Both Lives Matter. It's probably bothlivesmatter.org. So if you Google that, they have a really gracious, positive way of saying mum matters, baby matters. It's not one against the other, because often the debate is about the women's rights. So they're saying, yes, the woman does really matter, but so does the baby. So trying to change the atmosphere. So they're a great example.
Thank you.
Sometimes
No, go for it.
Well, just a little thought. Both on a national or a regional or a local level, when these discussions come up, I find the danger is that we evangelicals let our core position be reduced to these issues, and people try to get us make a statement that will justify them to put us in a drawer somewhere where we no longer feel partners to talk with.
Yeah.
And this is an art where we should help the evangelical community how to communicate on these issues without being reduced to these certain points. Just a thought.
Yeah, very good.
No, absolutely. And that is quite a challenge, because you want to do justice to our positions, and at the same time you don't want to be cornered and made to a single issue party, which we are not. Bible has way more to say than just about life and death and abortion.
Maybe there would be a task for the Evangelical Alliance to help in each of our countries to educate our constituency, not to be in their own thinking reduced. Some of them are, this is all they talk about, and they measure you by how you talk about it. Well, you think the Spirit leads me not to talk about this. We're talking about trafficking, or we're talking about educational quality, whatever.
Yes.
And so we should think about spreading a program among our constituent countries and alliances, how to raise the level of understanding with our own people, so that we have more of a real unanimous voice in not being reduced.
Yes. And you're right, Samuel, there's a strong pressure from the media to categorize us just by a couple of issues. And sometimes when some politicians, when they talk about Christian values, that's what they're talking about. Whereas, the idea of biblical values, and therefore God is concerned. Of course, he's concerned about the unborn and the dying. Of course, he's concerned about marriage and family, where everyone will thrive. But yes, he is also concerned about, justice and fairness and honesty in business, and in fair treatment of migrants and asylum-seeking claims, and care for the environment and education, where children can really thrive, whatever their abilities, etc. We need to be concerned about all of them.
Well, and the way you communicate on these topics is also important. In our code of conduct, we really want to be good news people. It's quite easy, communication-wise, it's always easy to clearly say what you're against. But we try to take that from another angle and say, well, God is concerned about this, and this is how it would look like if we would have the biblical principles lived out in our societies. So we try to come to the discussion with a more positive and winsome message rather than just with a kind of a plain no. It's only fueling that clash that is ultimately, in the long run, not the most helpful way to engage politics.
There is clearly a culture war on these kinds of issues. There's a culture war in Brussels. As EEA, we try to say there is a culture war, but we're not fighting the culture war. But that doesn't mean we don't care about the issues. We do, but we are trying to persuade. Culture war is simply, let's gather the numbers of people and let's see who will win in the vote. Whereas we are trying to convince people of the reasonableness and the positive nature of our message and trying to change minds. And that's where possible, we really would love to see. That's what evangelicals should be doing across Europe. It's not always easy, though.
But it starts at home. Then I hope it will trickle up rather than trickle down.
Yeah, I think that's a very significant point you're all making there, because we see it a lot in the UK. Julia will have seen this certainly, and it's not helped when an individual involved in an issue gets then involved in a legal dispute over that issue, because once you're into that arena, it's a very, very different way of approaching it. It's very adversarial, and it then does become about fine points and black and white rights and so on. And that again is what tends to make the news. That's what the media are interested in, because it's controversial and it's adversarial. We're trying to look at that within the education world and simply teach people, give them the confidence to be able to engage in debate without compromising their position, but also without alienating the people that they're debating with. And that's and to be able to do that in quite a politically charged environment. So it's not easy, but it is really important, because that's how you love people, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's what it boils down to. That's how you show love.
I think we'd love to learn from you, Graham, what you're passing on to your...
We have all the answers, Julia.
Of course you do. Good.
As usual.
So just put it in an email and we'll pass it on.
Yeah, we will. Well, we've got your boss talking, so she's got all the answers now.
Got the right questions.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Julia and Ari, and thanks everyone for interacting. I think we'll say goodbye to those who watched the recording at this point, and take the rest of our time here to pray. For those of you who watched the recording, you know how to pray yourselves, and you are encouraged to pray for Julia and for Ari and socio-political work of the EEA, and of course also for those challenging political topics in your own country. So thanks for joining, and we'll stop the recording at this point.